When? When are our politicians going to learn that to ignore us turns me into like Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction?
It's so true. Better to come on the show.
Come on.
Yeah.
Answer our questions, and we'll be done with it.
Mm-hmm.
And we move on.
Because otherwise you kind of almost become obsessed.
Well, because I believe that if people try to not come on and answer questions when they're in politics and when they've talked about transparency, it makes me wonder if they have something to hide. And so I've spent a lot of the weekend following up on the exclusive story that we broke on Friday about the new Seattle Director of Transportation. And I'll get to it in a couple of minutes here. But my advice to all politicians and political figures, if you come on, answer questions, generally we're done with it after that. Then we were satisfied. Maybe I won't like or agree with the answers, but generally there's nothing more to do with the story when you've come on and answered things. But when you don't do that, it truly does make me wonder if you have something to hide. And it continues to appear that the new Seattle DOT director changed his name about 10 years ago. And the more that I've found out about this over the weekend, the more legitimate questions. And when their communications people say there's a personal matter that's unrelated to his job, no, it's not. And I'll explain all of the legitimate questions that we would ask the guy. Next up, in the big lead.
The Big Lead, Dori Monson Show exclusive.
So, Nicole, where are we? Did you extend another invitation to Sam Zimbabwe on Friday to come on today?
Yes, I called on Friday, and then I sent another email this morning, and I haven't heard anything back.
Okay. There's a story, if you weren't listening on Friday, there's a story that we broke, an exclusive, thanks to one of our listeners, who, by the way, has been a really good tipster for me in the past as well. So when I saw that it was from this particular listener, I thought, well, I'll at least look into this. So Sam Zimbabwe was just named the Seattle Department of Transportation Director, the head guy for transportation in the city of Seattle. And what my listener told me was, did you know that Sam changed his last name somewhere between 2007 and 2011? He was, because we talked about this on Friday. I thought when I first heard his name is the new SDOT director, I just assumed he's probably an African-American guy. And then I saw him, and he's Caucasian. He's a Jewish fella. And he changed his last name sometime between 2007 and 2011. So we asked the DOT about it, and they said, that's very interesting. But it's a personal matter, and it's unrelated to his job, so we won't go into it. And the more I thought about this over the weekend, the more upsetting that response was. Because I think you and I, and remember, who was the first person in the media to tell you about Scott Kubley, his predecessor with the Seattle DOT? Who was the first person to call out how incompetent and ethically challenged Scott Kubley was? Well, it was our show. Because, again, that was a case where it wasn't a tip from a listener. It was somebody who sat in meetings with Scott Kubley. Somebody that I trusted, somebody that I knew to be a real professional when it comes to issues like government and transportation. And they said, Dori, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. This guy is so far over his head. And then we tracked when he ripped off the public for millions of dollars with the Prado bike scandal. And then, lo and behold, when Kubley got bounced, he ends up with a bike share company, getting a big fat job with them. So my antenna's up a little bit. And I want to know, why would somebody change their name from Sam Zimmerman Bergman to Sam Zimbabwe? And what's particularly odd about this is I think that he did it because, Zimbabwe sounds cool. And in Seattle politics, in D.C., where he was before Seattle, sounding cool is way more important than being great. It's all about image. It's about what sounds good more than what's really being accomplished here. And so we started looking into it more over the weekend. Some people say, well, his wife also had a hyphenated last name, and they didn't want to go with the 4 hyphen, I guess it'd be 3 hyphens between 4 last names. She's Jessica Bidwell Wendover, and he's Sam Zimmerman Bergman. And they said, well, maybe they took Zim from Zimmerman and B from Bidwell, and the A, we have no idea where that came from. And another B in Bergman, and the W in Wen. I mean, it's just a ridiculous. The people who are supporting him, defending him, they're coming up with all of these weird stretches as to why they might have picked Zimbabwe. But what's even odder about this is at the time he apparently picked Zimbabwe as his made-up last name, Zimbabwe was being ruled by murderous dictator Robert Mugabe. Mugabe was cited for human rights violations. Zimbabwe was one of the worst countries in the world when it came to human rights violations. He maintained the revolutionary socialist rhetoric of the Cold War. He blamed Zimbabwe's economic woes on capitalism in the West. Whoa! Well, that's certainly consistent with Seattle politics, where we have Marxists, literal Marxists, on the city council whose stated desire is to tear down our city and rebuild it with socialist Marxist principles, which is what they did under the murderous regime of Mugabe. But here's what's even stranger about this. One of the first stories that popped up when I was doing some research, why would somebody pick Zimbabwe as their last name? I know it sounds cool, and I know to climb the liberal political ladder in D.C. and Seattle, sounding cool is a big deal. So one of the first stories that popped up this weekend, and this is just weird, getting around the city with kids when formal transit has collapsed. And it was a story from citylab.com that said Zimbabwe once had a functional, even robust urban transit system. A well-connected and functional transportation system was one of the many elements that made Zimbabwe a jewel. In the years of political upheaval since, that system has become a mere mockery of its old self. The whistles of the trains that ferried urban locals from one point to the other have long been silent. The public trains, once operated by the National Railway, no longer run. Even the formal public bus system no longer exists. And the roads that once carried those buses are deteriorating and difficult to navigate. That dilapidation carries a heavy cost, particularly for women, and it's affected how they travel within and around the city with their children and babies. Issues that are compounded by class and inequality. And it talks about how sexual harassment and crime is so prevalent in what exists, what's left over of a transit system in what used to be a very functional country. That's what you pick as your made-up random last name? Zimbabwe? You want to be a DOT director here in Seattle, and you gave yourself a last name. You changed it as an adult, which I still want to know why. My tipster found that under his previous name, there may have been some liens against him, which I would love to ask him about that if we do get him on. We're looking into that. But I just want to know, why would you, if you could pick any name in the world, Why would you pick one that was being run, of a nation that was being run by a murderous dictator and had a transit system that had completely collapsed? Those are some of the questions that I would ask Sam Zimbabwe, the new Seattle Department of Transportation Director. If he comes on with us, we'll continue to try to get him on, and then we'll be done with it if he comes on. Or we can just keep looking into this more and more and more, because I'll still ask the questions, even if he won't provide the answers here.